Today is January 4th, 2025, and I am called to speak about transhumanism and colonial architecture and how specifically they relate to belonging and memory. So, what prompted initially this reflection for me was actually just my imminent experience in my family and within myself of like feeling through my capacity to remember things. These spaceships, these bodies that we are entrusted with, that we are bestowed with so miraculously, like we don't even need to try, and our bodies are proliferating life at every moment. That's a miracle. These bodies have the capacity to remember generations and generations worth of magic and memory encoded in our spine, which, as somebody I consider a teacher, Keone Hanale, says, the spine is the Akashic records. So we hold the memory of hundreds of generations of our ancestry in our spine. And of course, for those of us who are entrusted with wombs, physical wombs, although we all have energetic womb spaces, we also have the memory of our great grandmothers, just by virtue of us being here. And we have the memory of our children, for those of us who choose to have children, in our womb spaces for time and for generations forward. Our bodies are miraculous timekeepers, portals. And at the same time, a lot of this generation is experiencing an accelerated prominence of dementia. And those imminent reflections around memory, dementia, the capacity of our bodies to be miraculous timekeepers, and what is actually perhaps interrupting or manipulating that possibility, got me thinking a lot about everything. And specifically, it got me thinking about belonging and colonial architectures and transhumanism. So maybe we can start with belonging. What does it mean to belong? It's actually not an intellectual exercise, a theory. It's a feeling. It's a felt sense. You feel connected to. You have a tactile sense of connection to people, to places, to communities. And I think the one thing I want to really emphasize when it comes to belonging, which feels really clear as I really sit with what it means to feel like you are in relationship with people, is the responsibility and the innate original instruction that we hold as creators in distinction to as consumers. And under the endemic, saturated culture of consumerism and capitalism in which most of us inhabit, there is an enslavement that is almost subtly just pronounced. Subtly pronounced. It's just normalized of us being consumers. And that's the way that identity is related to as consumers of certain types of things a lot of the time. Or that's at least what's enforced upon us. Whereas in cultures of belonging, of true belonging, what I would say is that there is a sense of co-creative kinship. There is kinship based on a co-creation of economy, of care, of nourishment for one another. And so sitting with that responsibility, that entrustment, that original instruction to be creators, and how really that's compromised under capitalism and colonization. Sitting with that and how that relates to colonial architectures, which are architectures of isolation. And architectures of isolation can mean, for example, a condo unit in the middle of Toronto, Chukaranto, where you don't know your neighbors. You live in a 50-story condominium unit. There are maybe hundreds of families that you live with, but you don't really speak to any of them. That's something that is observable. And of course, there's other iterations of what isolationist architecture looks like, including white picket fences, the emergence of fences in general, the emergence of nuclear family unit houses across a lot of places. These are colonial architectures in distinction to architectures of community in many indigenous societies in which there is a very interdependent, circular, and just open. I mean, very physically open, i.e., there's a common courtyard where everybody in the village goes to cook together or to sacrifice an animal to eat together. There's very specific types of communal spaces for people to be in co-creative economy, responsibility, and proliferation of life together. And that is a simple way to look at the difference between a colonial architecture and then also an indigenous architecture. And of course, there's many nuances to what those things mean, very distinctions based on culture, but that's the generalization I will offer at the moment. And how that relates to transhumanism is, what is transhumanism? It's actually an orientation towards the manipulation and the reconfiguration of the human vessel with the insertion of external technologies, and specifically technologies that actually upload certain types of memories into our system and that also can create programs, like quite literally like software in this computer. And that's done through certain types of very mechanically oriented technologies that can be controlled by external forces. And a chip might be an example of this. And I'll link a few videos that I've been sitting with below, in which there's some examples that are shared around. For example, the introduction of this idea for all babies by 2030 to have chips implanted into them, purportedly, perceivably to support their success within capitalism. I mean, that's not the way that they said it, but their success within the type of society that we're increasingly growing into within the quote-unquote West. I say quote-unquote West because there's a lot to unpack on as to what is the West, how it was created. It's actually created through colonization. So it's really this colonial construct that has been upheld in a very specific way. But all this to say, transhumanism, which is this orientation towards manipulations and reconfigurations of our body that require technologies to be implanted similar to softwares that can be controlled by external forces. That is one understanding. There are many understandings of transhumanism. There's much more depth that we can go into, but that's one understanding. So what's the relationship between colonial architecture and transhumanism? The relationship is that what we can observe, what I can observe, so I'll say for myself, is that the orientation towards transhumanism is largely from an understanding that there is a paradigm of perfection that we need to grow into as humans. So there's certain words like telos in philosophy or teleology about like these sort of like linear frameworks of what we need to grow into to become more evolved and perfect. And within those paradigms, there's an understanding of our body not being sufficiently perfect. That there needs, within this paradigm of transhumanism, that there needs to be the insertion of, again, externally controlled technologies to be able to proliferate the perfection of the human vessel. And these paradigms, which are based on underlying understandings of imperfection in the human body, what I observe is that they're created within systems of isolation that really create the foundations for us to not see ourselves as perfect. When we are isolated from one another, there is a pathology that happens. This is seen in the way that cancer cells grow. This is seen in the ways that in the pandemic there was a proliferation of suicide rates under isolation. This is seen in so many circumstances, and it's almost like obvious. I don't know if I need to talk about cancer, if I need to talk about how profoundly depressing the pandemic was for a lot of people. Although I will say I quite enjoyed in some aspects the pandemic, given some of the solitude that I already largely chose in my life, and the way that it really invited me to be deeper in that solitude. But still, there was a lot of isolation, and it was enforced in a legal way, in a very, very surveilling way. And it's in many places. So the colonial architectures which create isolation, they also create the conditions for people to become addicted to other than human and largely digital, because that's one of the ways that we're moving as a society is towards digital saturation, towards digitization. So what we see increasingly is that people are turning to computers, to technologies, to certain types of media that can be addictive online, so including social media, including pornography, including all of these things that create very, very instant forms of gratification and dopamine hits biochemically. This is measurable that, some people say that um, in the previous generation, the addiction paradigm was the nicotine. And in our generation, it is the dopamine from social media, the dopamine from forms of technology that allow us to access instant gratification in very specific ways. And within this addiction, this very, very easily cultivated addiction to technology, there is a slippery slope in which the type of dependency and the type of comfort, ease, convenience, and also the desperation when we are isolated, like in nuclear family units. A lot of the times, these nuclear family units also create trauma. Like our bodies it's only been 1 or 2 generations that we have lived this isolatedly, and that creates a lot of that creates a certain type of isolation in our felt experience of the world that can create trauma in its own way. When we're this isolated and under capitalism, working 9 to 5s, these are not normal conditions to quickly evolve into in 1 generation. I mean, they're normal now, but they weren't 1 or 2 generations ago. So all this to say that the type of isolation that colonial architectures, nuclear family units, in which there's a lot more competition and a lot more consumerism than there is collaborativity and co-creation, lends itself to also the conditions for desperation for certain types of connection that are easily gratified through online forms and digital forms of media. And within that, there's also a very easy way that transhumanism, i.e., oh, I'm lonely. Okay, I have this instant form of perceived sense of connection that is actually quite shallow in its own way, because it doesn't require me to actively be in a co-creative relationship unless I'm interfacing with somebody who's a live human on the other end, for example. And that is the case sometimes, but it's very easy to be just a consumer and just to receive, and not to co-create, not to have to actually be in a place of active co-participation and creating something. And within that context, the capacity to actually feel isolated, the capacity to also be in what I would say is competition culture and plagiarism culture, where you perceive other people in very specific types of curated, documented ways. And then there's a sense of like, oh, am I good enough compared to these other people? That type of culture, which is so easy to become part of and to like orient towards when you're not actually interacting with live people in front of you who can actually be in a place of like having live, evolving, dynamic conversations where you're seeing somebody beyond surface level. When you just see people in these very, very shallow ways on screens, that easily lends itself to a sense of competition, to a sense of even more isolation. And that sense of sometimes dejection that can come from that can also create this very easy desperation, a very easy sort of vulnerability towards wanting to be better in quick ways, in quick fix ways, to wanting to have an experiential reality, a holographic reality in quick ways. And that's something that transhumanism can offer. It can offer quick ways to be better, to experience in a holographic way, because not only there's so many ways transhumanism can exist. One is through, like, for example, maybe the classic, or like one easy way is like the chip in the body, but then there's also these other ways where we're really implanting our mental bodies to experience holographic realities that are not actually live interactive realities. They're like chips through which we experience a holographic reality. And that's like an easy way to feel connection. Like, you don't even have to go out there and like meet people. You can just put a chip in your body and experience something in a holographic way. So that's all I feel called to share at the moment. That the isolation under colonial architectures, which really it tugs at the innate sense of like belonging that we need as human beings. And it also creates the conditions for us to really have to almost give away our memory. There's a lot that you don't have to remember on a biophysical level. When something's being inserted into your body, the hard drive, the capacity of the hard drive to actually not have to rely on external forms to remember. And we have so much capacity to remember through our spines and through our wombs. There's a lot to say about that, which maybe I don't have the bandwidth to like go deep into right now, or like, yeah, just want to chill for now. But what's other reflections I want to share on transhumanism, colonial architecture, memory, and belonging?